Hey, Superachievers! This episode is part of a very special series I have curated for you. Your level of emotional intelligence is one of the most significant contributors to your success in life, however you choose to define success for you. In my emotional intelligence workshops, I use the EQI 2.0 model to help professionals and leaders assess how they are doing in self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal relationships, decision-making, and stress management, the main areas of the model. The model contains 15 competencies grouped into each of the areas I just mentioned. You can learn more about the model at mhs.com. So what is so special about this series? Each episode is a deep dive into a competency from the model with an expert who provides you with strategies for improving your emotional intelligence. In this episode, Whitten Rutledge talks about independence as it relates to emotional intelligence and how you can balance your needs with those of others. Whitten is the Special Projects Coordinator for OKA. He manages workshops, coaching events, website design and upkeep, technical support, and creates blog content. Welcome, Whitten. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on.
Well, I love that we're going to talk about independence because that's one of my favorite areas of the wheel here. What do we call it? Is it a wheel?
The circle?
The circle?
I don't know.
The
EQI
round thing
wheel
that we're going to talk about? Yes. But before we get into that, can you share a little bit about your background with our listeners / watchers, I guess we'll call them?
Yeah. So hi, everyone. I'm Whitten Rutledge. I'm the Special Projects Coordinator at OKA, Otto Kroger Associates. And my background with EQ isn't particularly extensive. My father is another employee / president of OKA, and so EQ is kind of what he's always done. That's a lot of his life's work. And so I never had a chance to avoid it. That was just something I was always involved in. And so I was a teenager taking certification courses alongside professionals and everything. So I've always been in the EQ and the MBTI and the other kind of behavioral tools and certifications. And so I love the EQI. I think it's really interesting. I think there's a lot that can be gained from it both personally and professionally, and I'm excited to talk about it today.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, it's really cool that you grew up around this. My daughter is very similar. She's like, yeah, I've heard all that, Mom. Yes. Oh, so our topic of independence today, the subscale, can you define that for folks who maybe aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, so I'd say the easiest way to define the independence element of the EQI is the ability to be self-directed and to be free from emotional dependencies on others.
So what does it look like when someone is a little bit lower in that?
Yeah, so people in low independence can be clingy. They can appear indecisive. That might be people who are easily swayed by something. You know, if you suggest an idea and they say yes, and then, someone else suggests a completely different idea and they say, oh, actually, that's a good idea too. And so people in low independence are people who struggle to make decisions for themselves.
Yeah, I'm almost hearing a little bit of codependency in there.
Yes, that's exactly.
And people pleasing.
Mm-hmm, very much so, yeah.
Which is a common problem that I find in my emotional intelligence classes are people, they want to help other people. How can you identify maybe the difference between people pleasing and that desire to help others?
That's a really interesting question. So I think the desire to help others is actually its own element. Social responsibility is another element of the EQ, which is interestingly tied into independence. I actually have a note, so we'll put a pin in that and get to it later. But people pleasing is a little bit about, everyone has their own opinions. Everyone has their own ideas. And people in low dependence might be a little quick, a little bit too willing to put aside their own opinions, their own ideas, their own kind of areas of importance so that they can get in line, that they can follow what everyone else is doing. Whereas doing something to help people, it might be its own thing.
Yeah, they can be separate, right? So those that are low in independence, meaning they tend to, put others' needs in front of their own, or not voice their opinions, etc. How can they? What are some strategies that they can improve in that area?
So there are a couple different interesting ones, and I always like to think of actionable steps as there's short-term action, something that you could do this very afternoon.
Ooh.
And then longer term strategies to kind of build out in the future, this is what I want to work on as a person.
Yeah.
And so for some quicker things, if there's ever an opportunity to work alone or to make a solo contribution, volunteer. Speak up and say, you know what, this is something I struggle on. I want to practice doing things on my own, so that other voices might not tangle you up quite as much. It's another strategy is to constantly make a habit and take down notes of times that your opinions and ideas differed from those around you. You don't even have to, if independence is something you struggle on, if you're low on independence, you don't even have to say it out loud in the beginning. If it's something that you're just starting to work on, just take an internal note or a physical note that you remind yourself of later about times that you didn't exactly already fit with the crowd. Times that you differed and were independent from everyone else. And then an easier, more personal one that you can do over time is to do something you enjoy by yourself. I took myself to the movies for the first time ever last week, and it was a wonderful experience. I was like, wow, this is really fun. I got off work. My girlfriend was busy, and I said, you know what? I'm just going to go see a movie. And I had a great time. It was so much fun. And so it helps to shake your routine up and say, normally this is something I reserve for a group activity, but I'll do it myself.
So it sounds like being more comfortable with doing stuff on your own is like a first step. Maybe as you were thinking, I was thinking of, maybe go on a date with yourself, like take yourself to dinner and a movie.
Absolutely. Yeah, there you go.
Or in my case, I'd love to do an escape room solo. That would be pretty cool.
That would be really fun. I've only done one of those once. And it definitely can be an exercise. I imagine that it can be an exercise in patience, depending on who you go with.
Yes.
I went with my family and I happened to have a great time. But good. I understand that might not be the case for everyone.
Well, it helps when you're going with an emotionally intelligent group as well.
I imagine it is.
A much better experience. So really essentially, it sounds also being comfortable with solitude.
Absolutely.
A little bit. Yeah. And some reflection on that. What are some long-term goals or strategies, I should say, for moving forward?
I think it's really about learning to value your own opinions and be comfortable learning how to speak up for yourself. It's not just speaking up for yourself. Assertiveness is its own EQI element, but that learning that the world isn't going to end if you stand up and if you speak out or if you don't do what everyone else is doing. Understanding that having an opinion that differs from the group isn't always going to create some uncomfortable conflict. The more you do it, the more you realize like, oh, I'm all right.
Yeah.
That I'm a smart person. I'm a valuable person. My opinions matter. My contributions matter. Taking note of times that you didn't go with the flow and you realized that you were right. Making a habit of doing those things regularly. And one day you wake up and realize like, oh man, I'm not as codependent or as clingy as maybe I once was.
Yeah. So I'm also hearing, speaking up, and as we do that more and more, our comfort zone expands, right? As we're uncomfortably comfortable. And there was something else I was hearing in that too. Making sure your voice is heard, essentially. Yeah. Now, why is independence? So on the EQI model, we call it a leadership derailer if someone is lower in it. So why would independence be so important for a leader?
Well, so independence is incredibly important for a leader because you need the autonomy to be able to make decisions that other people might not agree with, might not understand. That if you're a leader and constantly being swayed by your direct reports, you're not really leading anyone.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting, I think politics is a really interesting example of how independence can function in a leadership role, because a good leader should have some kind of comfortable balance between I listen to my direct reports, I listen to my constituents, I'm working and making sure that they are benefiting from it. And other times you want to lead them. You want to say, I have a vision and I have a goal and I want to take us there. And so I'm going to make decisions as a group that will lead us to a place. That's how innovation happens. And so independence is crucial for a leader to be able to understand, get above the group dynamic and understand what needs to happen and what decisions need to be made.
Yeah. And it sounds like building it up is the same strategies that we've just covered as well. Yeah. Now, are there some other subscales that could help if they worked in one, like assertiveness? It would help them in this one as well?
Yeah, I think assertiveness is a really big one. I think hold on, I'm sorry.
Regard, right? Am I right?
Yep, yeah. There you go. You already got it.
As soon as you said self, I was like, oh, self-regard.
Yeah, I think self-regard is an incredibly important one because a lot of low independence can come from some place of self-deprecation and of self-consciousness, and that having some real firepower behind your words, your actions, what you think, what you believe, looking and seeing, look how far I've come, look at all that I've done, look at all that I've accomplished in my life, and feeling worthy of independence, I think, is an important thing for people that can come through assertiveness and self-regard in particular.
Yeah, I like that. How those are connected, right? So essentially we need to like ourselves and believe that our voice needs to be heard too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now let's flip the coin here, if you will, and look at someone who may be a little too independent, because we can use our strengths so much they can become our weaknesses. What does that person look like? Their behaviors.
This is interesting because this is something that I've had to work on, is being too independent. And it's actually one of my favorite stories to tell about myself. Is I was 5 years old, and it was getting to a point where, you're making friends. You're not just in your own house the whole time. And so my parents thought it was really important for me to learn how to ride a bike. And whatever part of my brain that my independence EQ score is rooted in decided that was the hill I was going to die on. And so I stuck my flag in and said, no, I'm not going to learn how to ride a bike, simply because I was counter dependent. That this law, this rule existed. And because it existed, I had to be independent of it. And so I decided I was never going to learn how to ride a bike. Completely devoid of all rationality. It doesn't make sense. I was a kid and my parents were absolutely befuddled. And I still don't know how to ride a bike. And so I am now a grown adult. And I don't know how to ride a bike because as a kid, I decided I wasn't going to do it. And then by the time I was an age that I had to go places, I drove and I had my license. And so that is a silly example of what too high independence can look like.
Yeah, don't tell me what to do. Instead of they should have said, I bet you can't ride a bike in the next 2 weeks.
Oh, that's perfect because that's how my dad used to get me to eat my vegetables. That he'd put it on the fork and say, I am the most powerful piece of broccoli in the world, and no one can defend. And of course, that was all it took. And so, those are some funny.
What he was doing, though, right? Like I knew what my dad was doing, but I still couldn't help myself.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You couldn't resist the idea of, no, I must be in charge. I must be, So those are some pretty silly examples of
very real
over independence. Very real. I'm glad that I can now tell that story in hindsight and have it be something funny and ridiculous.
Yeah.
But it's a problem in lots of workplaces, especially in my sports background, where people don't realize that they're being that silly and ridiculous. They're just very self-aggrandizing. And that someone who's overly independent can be emotionally withholding. They can be detached. They can be uncollaborative. And so they can, the ability, we talked about independence and leadership, and the ability to kind of rise above the fray and make decisions can be a really valuable thing. The problem is if you never get into the fray, then you have a bunch of direct reports or colleagues even who feel like, oh, this person thinks they're too good for this. They're too good to listen to us and to help us or to make decisions with us. So being independent can be great. Being too independent can be a mess.
Yeah. So then what are some ways that we can maybe overcome that? I know it's hard to downplay a strength that's become a weakness, but what are some ways we can overcome that?
Yeah. So a great thing with the EQ is when you're too high in a particular element or subscale, the way that you fix that you counter that, is to practice your other emotional subscales. It's not just, oh, well, stop doing that. Because that's okay. That's not good action. Yeah, it's not helpful. And so in my opinion, I think some of the best ways to help balance out too much independence are to focus on interpersonal relationships, to focus on empathy, and to focus on social responsibility. That's just one of the things we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And that learning to plug into the world around you, to your interpersonal relationships. How do you get along with other people at the office? How do you get along with your significant other at home? How do you get along with your kids? How do you get along with your friends? That focusing on those can help fizzle away some of those barriers that people with high independence build around themselves. With empathy, with learning to put your feet in their shoes and understand, like, what is this person going through? What does this person experience? What does the world look like from their point of view? That can really help to break down some of your over independence. And then with social responsibility, which is a little bit of a mix of both of those, but to plug into not just your friends, not just the people immediately around you, but your community. And that could be like your county, that could be your office building as a whole, that could be your entire state, that can be your country, that can be whatever it is. But what's going on around you? What matters to people besides the ones who are friends with you? That all of those things can help bring you back down to earth and not be just closed in your box of independence. I think all of those 3 subscales can help.
Oh, nice. And we have episodes on all of those. So great.
We do indeed. Yeah.
Awesome.
That's one of the great things about the EQI is just they're all connected. Yeah. They all have something to do with the other.
I love that. And then you work on one area of high impact and it impacts others. So it's
absolutely
amazing. Mm-hmm. All right. What is your last piece of advice for our listeners?
So I have 2 pieces of advice. One is a general piece of advice that I give anytime anyone ever asks me anything. And that is, it's a quote from BoJack Horseman, a show on Netflix. Uh-huh. And I'm not going to get into the context of it, although it's a little bit important. But basically, he starts exercising. And the show is very much about mental health. And so it's not about the runs that he's going on. It's about learning to become a better and more balanced person. But ultimately, he's on a run and he passes out. And someone else comes up and says to him, it's hard. And it's always going to be pretty hard. It gets easier, but you have to do it every day. Ooh. And that's the hard part, but it gets easier.
Yeah.
And so that's my one piece of advice for no matter what you're doing is if it sucks, if you're too high in independence, if you're too low in independence, it's hard. It gets easier, but you have to work on it every day.
Yeah.
That's the hard part. Second, for independence is to take a step back and realize that the world is a better place with you in it, but does not revolve around you. Yeah. So I'll leave it at that. I'll leave that. I don't have to explain that.
I love it. Oh, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
To learn more about Whitten, visit his website at oka-online.com.